The sun had barely climbed over the ridge when the unmistakable roar of a Jeep engine shattered the early morning calm of our ranch, a sound that made my grandfather freeze mid-step, wrenching the old, weathered spade from the earth as if it were a weapon, and I could see the flicker of that familiar fire in his eyes, the one that had kept this land safe for generations. Long before the fake HOA cops thought they could waltz in and claim dominion over our dirt and gravel roads, I had been sipping my coffee on the porch, the bitter heat searing my tongue, when I noticed the dust cloud on the horizon, a rolling, menacing wave that made my chest tighten, and then I recognized the vehicle, the black Jeep, the flashing but suspiciously dull police lights, the two men inside wearing cheap, mismatched badges that looked like they'd been printed at a Staples the night before. And my stomach sank because this wasn't just some random trespasser, this was a calculated invasion, a brazen attempt to intimidate our family, and Grandpa didn't wait for them to get closer. His mind, honed by decades of surviving storms, wildfires, and city bureaucrats who thought land ownership was negotiable, already started plotting the perfect trap, knowing that if they made it past the first gate, the consequences would be their own undoing, and he was not about to let a couple of impostors ruin the piece of the ranch he had built with his own hands. I watched, half in awe and half in terror, as he disappeared into the barn, returning moments later with ropes, chains, and a large coil of barbed wire, his movements precise, deliberate, almost ritualistic, as if every knot tied and every spike driven into the ground carried the weight of decades of frustration with people who didn't respect boundaries, while the Jeep crested the hill and slowed to a suspicious crawl. The two men inside laughing nervously as if the morning had promised them an easy payday, not realizing that Grandpa had spent years preparing for exactly this scenario, teaching us every trick in the book for defending the ranch, and even improvising new ones when the situation demanded, and then, with a grin that was both mischievous and terrifying, he disappeared behind the grove of oak trees lining the road, reappearing on the far side with a homemade ram barrier, a contraption of logs, chains, and old tractor parts that looked like it belonged in a demolition derby rather than a defense against trespassers. And he positioned it so that the Jeep had no choice but to follow the path he wanted, which funneled them straight into a patch of ground he had secretly hollowed, a natural pit that could swallow a Jeep up to the axles if they weren't careful, and as they approached, the fake cop in the driver's seat leaned out, shouting, "Move aside! We're here on official business." But his voice wavered, betraying the confidence that was supposed to come with authority, and Grandpa, calm as a man who had faced real danger dozens of times, waved him forward like a matador coaxing a bull into the arena, every step calculated, knowing exactly how much pressure it would take to make them think they were in control when, in reality, the trap had been set weeks ago, long before they even planned their little stunt. I could feel my heart pounding against my ribs as the Jeep rolled closer, its tires crunching over gravel, the morning sun glinting off the makeshift badges that would have fooled no one with eyes half open, and then, just as they were perfectly aligned, Grandpa gave a sharp whistle, and the hidden pit sprung its secret, a combination of loose boards and reinforced soil that gave way under the weight of the Jeep, sending it lurching forward with a terrifying screech of metal against earth, the vehicle's front end dipping into the hole while the rear tires spun uselessly, and the men inside cursed, scrambled, and looked at each other with faces pale enough to make me think they might pass out, because this was no ordinary pit. It was a clever trap that Grandpa had reinforced with old tractor axles, railroad ties, and gravel that would shift but not collapse entirely, keeping them trapped just long enough for the law, real law, to be called if needed, though Grandpa had no intention of letting them go so easily without a proper scare, and I could hear him laughing from behind the trees, a deep, rolling sound that seemed to shake the air itself, and then he stepped into view, arms wide, his weathered hat tilted at just the right angle, his eyes twinkling with mischief, and he started walking toward them, not threatening but commanding, radiating the kind of authority that no badge could ever replicate, and the men in the Jeep, realizing too late that they had underestimated not just the ranch but the man who had built it, began fumbling with their doors, chains rattling against the frame as they tried to reverse out of the pit, but every movement only dug them deeper into the trap, and Grandpa, ever the showman, raised his voice, telling them, "Next time you want to play cop on my land, make sure you can handle the consequences," his tone calm but carrying the weight of generations, and I felt a mix of relief and adrenaline as I ran down to help him secure the Jeep with ropes, tying the wheels to nearby posts so they couldn't escape until real authorities arrived, watching their faces contort from smugness to sheer terror, and then Grandpa, turning to me, whispered with a grin, "Lesson 1 on our ranch, kiddo, never underestimate the old tricks, they're old for a reason," and I realized, in that single moment, that our family's legacy wasn't just about land or fences, but about cunning preparation, and an unshakable sense of justice that no fake badge, no flashy lights, and no audacious stunt could ever overcome. And as I looked back at the jeep, the morning sun casting long shadows across the uneven ground, I knew that this story, the one where two self-important imposters learned exactly why they shouldn't mess with Grandpa, would be retold countless times, each retelling adding more weight to the legend of how the ranch had survived another challenge, proving that sometimes brains and experience far outweigh badges and bravado. And in that moment, I understood why Grandpa had always said, the ranch was more than land. It was a living testament to resilience, creativity, and the sheer audacity to defend what was yours. And as the jeep sat half-submerged in its engineered pit, the fake cops panicking and shouting at each other, I could hear the distant sirens approaching, and I felt a surge of satisfaction, knowing that the morning had started with tension, but would end with a story no one would ever forget. A tale of wits versus arrogance, where the underdogs, or rather, the rightful guardians, emerged victorious, and I knew that the day had only begun, but already it had carved itself into the lore of our family and the legend of the ranch that would be told for decades to come, a story of clever traps, old tricks, and a grandpa who refused to let anyone, fake cop or otherwise, disrespect the land he had fought so hard to protect. Surge of adrenaline as Grandpa, already halfway to the grove of trees lining the southern edge of the property, began rigging a series of tripwires and weighted logs, creating an obstacle course that seemed chaotic but was in fact a carefully orchestrated web designed to control their speed and trajectory. And as the second jeep hit the first wire, a loud clatter of metal echoed across the ranch, and the vehicle jolted violently, tires digging into the ground as it skidded sideways, and I could see the fear in their eyes finally matching the horror they had tried to instill in us, while Grandpa, calm and deliberate, adjusted the tension on the next line, his movements fluid, almost elegant, as if he were conducting a symphony of chaos designed to teach a lesson these fake officers would never forget, and I watched, wide-eyed, as the jeep's momentum carried it straight into a cleverly placed mud trap that swallowed the undercarriage, leaving them spinning helplessly, horns blaring, while Grandpa's laugh, deep and resonant, rang out across the hills, a sound that seemed to make the trees themselves shiver, and in that moment, I understood fully what he had been preparing us for all our lives. The knowledge that control, patience, and clever use of your environment could topple even those who wielded authority without merit, and as the second SUV approached, having now witnessed the spectacular failures of its cohorts, the drivers hesitated, confusion and fear, battling with the arrogance that had brought them here, and Grandpa, noticing the hesitation, grinned beneath his hat, signaling me to ready the next line of defense, which involved a set of pulley-operated logs that, when released, would block the only escape route, creating a controlled bottleneck that forced the remaining vehicles into positions of vulnerability, and as I helped him set the mechanism, the men inside the SUVs cursed, tried reversing, shouting at each other with panic coloring every word, while the morning sun rose higher, casting long shadows that made the obstacles seem even more daunting, and in a crescendo of engineered chaos, the final jeep barreled over a hidden mound, tires hitting an anchored log that catapulted it sideways into a stack of barrels, the loud crash echoing across the ranch like a cannon shot, sending birds into the sky in a chaotic flurry, and I could feel my heart racing, each beat sinking with the adrenaline in my veins as Grandpa, walking calmly between the immobilized vehicles, surveyed the scene with satisfaction, eyes glinting with the knowledge that not only had he trapped them, but he had done it without a single person harmed, every movement precise, every obstacle placed with foresight, proving once again that experience, cunning, and an intimate understanding of your land could outmatch anyone's pretended authority. And just when I thought it couldn't get more intense, a new, unexpected sound pierced the air, a drone, hovering silently above the ranch, equipped with a camera, probably sent by some HOA stooge to record evidence against us, and Grandpa, without missing a beat, pulled a small net launcher from his coat, aimed it skyward, and fired with a crack that sent the drone crashing into the oaks, wires sparking and smoke curling into the morning air. And I couldn't help but laugh in disbelief at the sheer audacity of everything happening at once. The fake cops trapped, the drones downed, the barrels scattered, and Grandpa standing in the middle of it all like a general surveying a battlefield he had already won before the fight even began, all while he turned to me and said, "Remember this day, kiddo, this is what happens when people think rules on paper mean more than rules on the ground." And in that single instant, I felt the full weight of what it meant to be part of this ranch, to inherit not just land but a mindset, a combination of creativity, vigilance, and the stubborn refusal to ever bow to false authority. And as I watched the imposters banging on their doors, waving their arms, trying to call for backup that would take at least 20 minutes to arrive, I realized that the legend of Grandpa's traps was far from exaggerated, and that we were living it right now, a cinematic chaos of engineering, strategy, and psychological warfare, proving in the most spectacular way imaginable that sometimes brains, preparation, and a deep understanding of the land are worth more than badges, sirens, and threats, and as the morning sun fully illuminated the ranch, highlighting the twisted jeeps, scattered barrels, and dented SUVs, I felt a profound sense of pride, knowing that the day's battle was just beginning, but already we had won the first round in a story that would be retold for generations as the day the fake HOA cops learned, the hard way, that trespassing on Grandpa's ranch was not just ill-advised. It was impossible to survive unscathed, and as we moved to secure the remaining vehicles, adjusting chains, ropes, and strategically placed logs to ensure no further movement, I realized that this day, this morning of chaos and ingenuity, would be one that defined our family's legacy, a tale of courage, cunning, and the audacity to defend what was rightfully ours. And as Grandpa looked at me with that familiar twinkle in his eye, I understood that he was already planning the next steps, the ways to ensure that no one, ever again, would dare treat the ranch as anything less than sacred, because this land, these roads, and the traps hidden beneath its surface were more than protection. They were a warning written in sweat, wood, and stone, and as I followed him toward the barn to check on our final setups, I realized fully that the morning's events, wild and chaotic as they had been, were only the prelude to the legend we were actively creating, a story that would echo through the hills, forests, and valleys of this land for decades to come, teaching every would-be trespasser that cunning, preparation, and an intimate knowledge of your home can turn even the most audacious invaders into humbled lessons. And as I watched Grandpa set the final countermeasures with the calm precision of a man who had done this 1,000 times before, I felt an electrifying mix of fear, pride, and exhilaration, knowing that by nightfall, the fake HOA cops would have learned the full meaning of the phrase, "Never mess with the guardians of the ranch." A lesson taught not with violence, but with cleverness, patience, and the quiet, terrifying inevitability of a trap perfectly set. Just as the real sirens started echoing faintly in the distance, signaling that the law, the real law, was finally responding to Grandpa's discreet call the night before, I noticed movement at the edge of the ranch where the forest thickened, a shadow shifting unnaturally against the trees, and my heart skipped a beat because the jeep had only been the beginning. The fake HOA cops were not alone. They had brought reinforcements, men who clearly thought a gated road and a private ranch meant nothing, and as the first of them crested the hill in another black SUV, their lights glaring aggressively, I could see that arrogance in their stance, the kind that comes from people who have never been met with genuine resistance, and Grandpa, unshaken, was already in motion, disappearing behind the barn to retrieve yet another of his ingenious contraptions, because this land was a chessboard to him, and he knew exactly how to anticipate their moves, calculating angles, distance, and momentum, as if he could see every step they would take before they even thought of it, and I found myself both terrified and exhilarated as he emerged with several large barrels, rusty but reinforced, which he began rolling onto the incline of the hidden road, positioning them strategically so that the SUV approaching would have to swerve, brake, or risk damage, and just as the SUV slowed to assess the obstacle, Grandpa raised a hand, signaling a silent command that only someone who had grown up under his tutelage could interpret, and I felt the tension coiling in my stomach because the next move would be critical. The wrong placement of a barrel or miscalculated angle could give them the upper hand, yet everything about Grandpa radiated confidence, a mixture of experience and cunning, and as the SUV hesitated, the driver's confusion giving us precious seconds, I heard him mutter under his breath, "They never learn until they crash into it themselves," and my blood ran cold and hot at the same time, because I knew he was right and that within moments, their arrogance would collide spectacularly with our preparation. The SUV veered slightly to the left, trying to avoid the barrels, but the loose gravel and uneven terrain conspired with Grandpa's careful engineering, making the vehicle fishtail dangerously, tires spinning uselessly as it nearly toppled into a ditch Grandpa had subtly deepened, a trap hidden beneath foliage and branches that, to the untrained eye, looked perfectly natural, and I realized how much foresight had gone into every inch of this ranch, every curve of the road, every hollowed patch and reinforced pit, a testament to decades of defending against people who thought paper badges meant anything in the face of real authority and deep knowledge of the land. And then, as the SUV ground to a halt, teetering precariously, I saw movement behind it, another jeep, this one barreling down the secondary path Grandpa had predicted, flashing lights and loud horns, the men inside shouting threats and slurs as if volume alone could intimidate us, and I felt the moment I heard the crunch of gravel behind the last stalled jeep, a chill ran down my spine because it was obvious that these impostors, enraged, humiliated, and desperate, weren't going to give up quietly, and my heart raced as I saw the driver slam his door, gesturing wildly to his partner, shouting threats that bounced off the trees like hollow echoes. completely unaware that Grandpa had already anticipated this exact level of fury and had devised contingencies that would make their bravado crumble, and as they approached on foot, boots scuffing the dirt, I noticed the glint of something metallic in their hands, a crowbar, maybe even a tire iron, clearly intending to try their luck against our obstacles, and my stomach tightened because, despite all the traps and mechanical ingenuity we had employed, nothing could stop a determined person if they were willing to fight directly. But Grandpa, ever unflappable, raised a hand, signaling for me to stay back, and in that moment, I realized that what he was about to do would be more than just physical defense. It would be psychological warfare, turning their arrogance against them in a way they could never anticipate, and I held my breath as he stepped into the open, hands on his hips, posture calm but commanding, eyes narrowing beneath his weathered hat, every line of his face screaming experience and quiet menace, and the men froze, unsure whether to attack, flee, or reconsider every decision that had brought them to our land. And then Grandpa, without a hint of panic, began to speak, his voice calm but carrying a resonance that made the morning air feel heavy, recounting, in a precise, almost surgical manner, every little thing they had done wrong, every illegal step, every badge that didn't check out, every maneuver they had thought would intimidate us but had instead played right into our trap, and I could see the color draining from their faces as the reality sank in. They had been outsmarted from the moment they set wheels onto our property, and now every attempt to regain control only dug them deeper into the humiliation and chaos, and as Grandpa spoke, I could hear the faint click of hidden mechanisms being triggered, because he had anticipated that they might try to surround us, and sure enough, ropes, pulleys, and weighted logs moved silently into position, closing exits, creating narrow corridors, and making it impossible for them to advance without encountering new obstacles. And as the men hesitated, trying to read the landscape, their confusion turned to panic eyes, darting from pit to barrel to cleverly hidden wire, and in that instant, I realized that Grandpa had turned our entire ranch into a living, breathing trap, one that taught lessons through fear, precision, and the inevitability of failure for those who disrespected it. And just when I thought the situation had peaked, a loud, metallic clang echoed from the northern ridge, drawing everyone's attention, and I noticed the second wave of the imposter's plan, a pickup truck barreling down at high speed, thinking that brute force could undo the careful chaos we had orchestrated. But Grandpa, always one step ahead, had rigged a series of trenches and logs that funneled the vehicle into a narrow passage, and as it hit the first barrier, tires skidding and metal groaning under pressure, the driver realized too late that he was trapped in a corridor designed to slow, disorient, and ultimately neutralize any intruder. And the moment the vehicle ground to a halt against a pile of reinforced barrels, Grandpa's voice rang out across the chaos, commanding, mocking, and entirely fearless, and I felt a surge of awe because he had somehow managed to control not just the terrain but the very flow of events, orchestrating a symphony of traps, obstacles, and psychological pressure, leaving the impostors scrambling, shouting, and panicking, unable to make a single coherent decision without falling further into our carefully designed snare. And then came the final twist, the one Grandpa had hinted at with a glint in his eye earlier, the one that would seal the story in infamy. Hidden under the old wagon path, a series of weighted platforms and trip mechanisms triggered simultaneously, sending mud, gravel, and old hay bales cascading toward the trapped vehicles, creating a visual spectacle of controlled destruction, while the impostors screamed, flailing helplessly as every movement they made played directly into Grandpa's hands, and I could barely breathe as I watched the scene unfold. The perfect mix of chaos and control, terror and awe, a living demonstration of why preparation, intelligence, and intimate knowledge of your land mattered far more than fake badges or misplaced confidence. And then, as if the universe itself had joined Grandpa's side, a real police cruiser appeared on the horizon. Sirens blaring, lights flashing, and the impostors finally understood that the rules of the game had changed completely. No longer were they in charge, no longer could they intimidate or bluff their way through, and as the real officers assessed the scene, shaking their heads at the audacity of what had been attempted against a private ranch, Grandpa calmly approached me, his hat tilted just enough to shade his eyes, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, and whispered, "Lesson 2, kiddo. Never underestimate the old tricks and never, ever assume. Paper makes you powerful." And in that instant, I felt the weight of the morning, the adrenaline, the fear, the exhilaration, and the pride coalesce into a single, electrifying realization that we had not only defended our land but had done so with cunning, creativity, and the quiet, unshakable confidence of those who know the terrain better than anyone else. And as the real officers began taking statements, photographing vehicles, and securing the scene, Grandpa turned back toward the road, surveying the aftermath like a general inspecting a battlefield he had already won, and I could see the gleam in his eye, the one that said, without words, that the story didn't end here, that future trespassers would think twice before daring to challenge the guardians of this ranch. And just when I thought the drama had reached its climax, one of the fake cops, still half-trapped in the mud and mud-splattered jeep, attempted to crawl toward freedom, only to trigger a cleverly concealed wire that released a net over the vehicle, effectively immobilizing him completely, and I gasped, realizing that Grandpa had thought of everything, every conceivable action, every desperate attempt at escape, and had engineered a counter, turning their arrogance into utter helplessness, while I helped secure ropes, tighten pulleys, and reinforce barriers, my hands trembling from adrenaline and awe, and Grandpa, calm as ever, walked among the trapped impostors, recounting their mistakes in a voice that was both commanding and subtly theatrical, making each one understand, in the most visceral way possible, that their assumptions, their badges, their fake authority, counted for nothing here, and as I watched, I couldn't help but marvel at the meticulous planning, the intricate timing, and the sheer audacity of a man who had turned his entire ranch into a fortress, a maze, a gauntlet that would teach lessons for a lifetime. And then, just as the sun reached its zenith, casting sharp shadows across the immobilized vehicles, Grandpa signaled to me, and together we walked toward the final set of obstacles, barrels filled with water, strategically positioned to tip if disturbed, creating both a physical and psychological barrier, and the impostors, now completely at our mercy, scrambled to find any path to freedom, realizing too late that every choice, every movement, had already been accounted for, manipulated, and redirected by a mind that had spent decades mastering the land. And as I secured the last ropes, Grandpa placed his hand on my shoulder, eyes scanning the horizon, the ranch, the trapped vehicles, and the panicked men, and said with a satisfied, almost mischievous grin, "Remember, kiddo, sometimes the best offense is a defense no one can escape, and the best lesson is learned when arrogance meets preparation." And I knew in that instant that the story we were living, of fake HOA cops, jeeps immobilized in mud and netting, barrels strategically placed, tripwires, hidden pits, and ingenious countermeasures, would become legend, retold countless times around campfires, in hushed conversations, and perhaps even in viral videos someday, a testament to the ingenuity, patience, and sheer audacity of Grandpa and the family who had inherited not just a ranch, but a mindset that turned every threat, every challenge, every audacious trespass into a meticulously orchestrated lesson, leaving the impostors humiliated, the real police impressed, and our legacy as the unyielding guardians of this land firmly cemented in the annals of local lore. And as I looked at the jeep half-submerged in mud, the SUV wedged against barrels, and the final netted vehicle shaking helplessly, I felt a rush of exhilaration, fear, pride, and all at once, knowing that this day, this morning of chaos, ingenuity, and triumph, would be the day we had turned an attempted invasion into a story of cleverness, resilience, and unstoppable guardianship. And as Grandpa tipped his hat toward me, his eyes twinkling with that signature mix of mischief and authority, I understood fully what it meant to be part of this ranch, to inherit the wisdom, cunning, and audacity that define generations, and to know that no matter what impostors, fake cops, or audacious trespassers thought, this land, these roads, and these traps were ours, and we would defend them with intelligence, creativity, and an unshakable sense of justice, because that was the legacy Grandpa had built, and now, the one we were actively living. The first thing I noticed that morning, even before the adrenaline of the jeep, the SUVs, and the netted intruders fully faded, was the eerie quiet that settled over the ranch like a heavy blanket, the kind of silence that follows chaos but carries with it a sense of triumph, and my chest still thumped from the sheer intensity of the previous hours, the adrenaline slowly ebbing as Grandpa walked beside me, inspecting every barrel, rope, wire, and pit with an almost artistic scrutiny, a sense of pride radiating from him as he ensured nothing had been disturbed beyond what he intended. And I realized that today, the fake HOA cops, the jeeps, the SUVs, and the drone had all been part of a lesson so meticulously orchestrated that even the smallest mistake on our part could have backfired catastrophically, yet somehow, through a mixture of experience, ingenuity, and sheer audacity, we had emerged unscathed, and the impostors, now sitting immobilized, covered in mud and grime, yelling at each other in disbelief and fear, were living proof of just how effective Grandpa's planning had been. And as I surveyed the scene, I couldn't help but notice the transformation in the ranch itself, the dust settling over the trenches, the sun glinting off strategically placed barrels, the tripwires faintly swaying in the breeze, all forming a landscape that looked chaotic to an outsider, but was in fact a carefully choreographed maze designed to trap and intimidate anyone foolish enough to think they could bully their way onto our land. And Grandpa, tipping his hat back and letting out a long, satisfied sigh, turned to me and said, "Kiddo, sometimes people need to experience their mistakes firsthand to really learn." And I understood in that moment the depth of his teaching, that defending this ranch was about more than barricades and clever traps. It was about teaching respect, patience, and humility to anyone who thought they could trespass with arrogance and impunity. And just as I was processing this, a sudden movement caught my eye near the edge of the property, a figure slowly emerging from the forest with hands raised, and my heart skipped a beat because we hadn't anticipated anyone else being involved. But it was one of the real police officers, walking cautiously toward us, assessing the scene, and I could see the mixture of shock and admiration on his face as he took in the immobilized vehicles, the clever use of terrain, and the sheer audacity of our defensive measures. And as he approached, Grandpa greeted him with the calm authority of a man completely in control, explaining, in precise detail, how the traps had been set, how the impostors had been caught, and how no one had been seriously harmed despite the chaos. And the officer, nodding slowly, clearly impressed, remarked on the ingenuity, the foresight, and the undeniable skill that had gone into what could have easily been a dangerous situation, but had instead turned into a masterclass in strategy and defense. And I felt a swell of pride as Grandpa, always the storyteller, recounted the sequence of events with dramatic flair, emphasizing the moments where the impostors' arrogance led them straight into traps, their every mistake magnified by the meticulous planning of decades of experience. And as he spoke, the impostors tried desperately to protest, their voices drowned out by the laughter of the officers and the overwhelming evidence of their own failures. And I realized, in that instant, that today's events would be talked about for years, not just by our family, but by anyone who heard the tale of how the fake HOA cops, thinking they could intimidate us, had been utterly outsmarted, humiliated, and rendered powerless by a combination of preparation, wit, and an intimate knowledge of the land. And then, as if the day wasn't already intense enough, one of the impostors, panicking, attempted to reach a tool he had brought in the back of the Jeep, only to trigger a final hidden mechanism Grandpa had installed weeks ago, a spring-loaded log that rolled across the ground, blocking access and sending the man stumbling backward, covered in mud, his attempts at control entirely futile. And the officer, shaking his head in disbelief, had to physically intervene to calm the situation, proving to me that Grandpa's foresight had accounted for nearly every conceivable contingency, leaving only the choice for the impostors to finally surrender, which they did with a mixture of anger, humiliation, and grudging respect. And as they were guided to stand together under police supervision, I watched Grandpa slowly walk the perimeter of the ranch, checking every obstacle, adjusting ropes, reinforcing tripwires, and even tweaking the mud pit so that it would dry evenly but still remain hazardous to anyone attempting a repeat stunt. And he looked at me, eyes twinkling with that mixture of pride and mischief that always made me smile despite the tension, and said, "This is how you defend what's yours, with brains, patience, and a little creativity." And I realized that in the chaos, the traps, and the immobilized vehicles, there was a lesson far deeper than just protecting property. It was about teaching respect for boundaries, the value of preparation, and the importance of thinking several moves ahead, lessons that no paper badge or false authority could ever convey. And then, as the police took statements, photographed the scene, and prepared to tow the vehicles, a helicopter appeared on the horizon, circling to get a visual of the entire ranch, likely responding to a call from the HOA to document evidence. And Grandpa, never missing a beat, signaled for me to prepare one final spectacle, a controlled release of smoke from strategically placed barrels and mud pits, creating a dramatic cloud that obscured the ranch temporarily, ensuring that any aerial footage would capture chaos, not clarity, a last touch of theatrical genius that left everyone, from officers to impostors to bystanders, thoroughly impressed. And as the smoke settled, revealing the ranch in its full, chaotic glory, I felt a wave of relief, exhilaration, and pride wash over me, knowing that today our family had not only defended our land but had turned an attempted intimidation into a story of cleverness, resilience, and strategic mastery. And Grandpa, finally resting, leaned on his cane, surveying the scene with satisfaction, recounting every twist and trap with delight, emphasizing to me that every barrel, pit, wire, and rope had a purpose, every movement had been calculated, and every moment had been designed to teach a lesson. And as the officers escorted the impostors away, shaking their heads in disbelief at the elaborate defenses, I realized fully the scope of what had happened. Our ranch, our home, had survived an invasion that could have ended in disaster, yet had instead become a testament to ingenuity, preparation, and the unshakable courage of a family determined to protect what was theirs. And then Grandpa, turning to me with that familiar grin, said, "Remember, kiddo, some people think authority is a shield, but on our land, it's brains, patience, and knowing every inch of the ground beneath your feet that wins the day." And in that instant, I felt the full weight of generations, the pride of defending our legacy, and the thrilling satisfaction of having witnessed, participated in, and survived a day that would be told countless times in the years to come, a story of fake HOA cops, Jeeps immobilized, SUVs trapped, tripwires, barrels, mud pits, smoke clouds, and above all, a grandfather whose cunning, foresight, and audacious spirit had turned chaos into legend. And as the sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the ranch, highlighting every dent, splash of mud, and carefully positioned obstacle, I understood completely that this was more than a victory. It was a masterclass in defense, strategy, and the art of turning audacity into a lesson. And as we walked together back to the porch, tired, exhilarated, and smiling, Grandpa patted me on the back and said, "This land, these roads, these obstacles, they're more than protection. They're a story, a warning. And now you're part of it." And I knew, in that single electrifying moment, that the legend of our ranch, the day the fake HOA cops thought they could take us on and failed spectacularly, would live forever, a story of clever traps, precise timing, audacious defense, and the unwavering courage of a family who refused to back down, proving once and for all that brains, preparation, and intimate knowledge of your home could outmatch any badge, siren, or false authority. And as night fell over the ranch, painting the hills and forests in deep indigo shadows, I felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that we had not only survived but had turned a potential disaster into a tale of triumph, ingenuity, and legacy, a story that would be told for generations as the day our land, our rules, and our ingenuity triumphed over arrogance, audacity, and fake authority, forever cementing our place as the unshakable guardians of the ranch.